And this is letter 21, The Fool. Alice?
Well, here we are. We're reaching the end, very close to the end of this collection of letters. And we've come to the letter 21, which is represented by the Fool. This is where Tomberg decided to place this card. He knew that it was controversial, that in the tarot deck, the Fool is represented by the number 0. So, or maybe in the other regular card deck, maybe that's where the Joker comes from. The Joker card is a card that can be used as a trump card wherever you want to put it. It's the Joker. It's the trickster, the surprise card. You don't know what it is. So he's decided to place it here. That's his, and he gives his apology and a defense of that, of why he placed it here. But Charlotte gave me a pop quiz before I had read this again. I hadn't read it for 20 years. And she said, okay, so Alice, what does the Fool card represent? What is it? What is it? What is it? And I was like, I don't know. I haven't opened it yet. And she said, love, amor. The letter shin, which of course she has taken as the icon, the letter shin, she has taken as the icon for her entire publishing company. So this is very important. And it is, in essence, that would be the Fool then becomes the icon and the, you might say the icon right here of the entire Hermetic work. The entire practice of the Hermeticist might be summed up as the card of the Fool, in the sense that the love, the esoteric name of love, amor, is all encompassing to the entire Hermetic philosophy, is surrounded in this wonderful element of love, and everything moves within it. So moving on from there, let me move on to the basic image on the card, which is a man in baggy clothing. He has jester's bells around the yoke of his shoulders. There's a yoke of jester bells. He's walking, he's leaning on a staff. His left hand is crossing the front of the body and holding a staff with a cloth bag over his right shoulder. And he's turning 3/4 to the right. He points out that this is all symbolic of the left and right, the left hand, right hand path. He's holding a staff with a cloth bag, which is hanging. And he is attacked from behind by a dog. A dog is biting his trousers and threatening to rip them, but he is not making any effort to ward off the dog with the walking stick or with anything. So he is just allowing this to happen. He's passive, being attacked from behind. He's wearing a yellow bonnet. There's a red bell. There's bells. And he is dressed in the traditional medieval clown outfit or jester outfit, or he's also called the buffoon. So this is the Fool of God, is what Tomberg calls him, the Fool of God. And later there's the Fool in spirit that he goes into, talking about being the Fool in spirit. But what's important, he points out, is this tendency to the right with the angle of the head, and the right shoulder bearing the staff, the right hand on the walking stick, walking left to right across the card. He points out that that is an indication of his direction. So then he moves into the archetypes of the Fool throughout literature and history. First one he mentions is Don Quixote of Men of La Mancha, which is of course where we get the word quixotic. Who starts out as being called El Loco, and he ends up being called El Bueno, but the crazy and the crazy man and the good man. So the Fool is a very ancient archetype, and Tomberg goes on to talk about the magical entities of the arcana of the tarot. So he's using this card really to dance around all the other cards. It's kind of a dance he does. And a lot of it is review of the previous cards and how they all fit together as a stream of archetypes. So this is what I got from this letter, was a lot of dancing around and a lot of review of things.
He gets that a bit from Shmakov.
You got a bit from Shmakov too.
A little bit who he studied, because Shmakov, perhaps in a way that the others don't, really hangs his hat on the Fool as being, I mean, I think it's the most important arcanum anyway, in the sense that if you're only going to read one, you should read this. But in the Holy Book of Thoth of Shmakov, he does sort of go into every single arcanum as expressions of the Fool. So I think you're exactly right in what you say there. He's obviously picked up on this tradition, and also the very, very ancient underpinnings of the tradition, because I think one of the first archetypes of the wandering fool is found in the Zohar. And I think a lot of the Kabbalistic underpinnings to what we're studying come from that original fool, from the Kabbalah. And as you say, goes through Don Quixote, and for the Russians, there were other examples that were more particular to them and not quite so relevant. But I certainly think that between the wanderers of the Zohar, the travelers, the mystical traveler, Don Quixote, and then our Fool, you've got a very, very clear thread. I think that's a really important point to mention.
So the wandering Jew is from the Zohar. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That archetype of Ahasuerus, is that his name?
Not sure.
Ahasuerus, yeah, the wandering Jew. I read a book by that title at some point by a German author. I can't remember, but it was very good. So we pick these things up as archetypal figures through Orpheus. So the different archetypes that are moving through here. We mentioned Man of La Mancha and the Wandering Jew. They each represent one aspect of this arcanum or other, or the arcanum is the sum total of all of these dynamically working together. Orpheus being the love of a soul torn away by death and its yearning for reunion beyond the veil. Well, we can see the implications of that. So that touches on the card as being the arcanum of love of a soul torn away by death and its yearning for reunion beyond the veil. The other immortality is another meaning of the card. The aspiring to, this is the one that's connected to the Wandering Jew, crystallization. The soul aspiring to the coagulation of the vital body, the etheric body, to become stone and resist death. I was reminded of the poem by Shelley, I think it is, Ozymandias. Is that the name? Ozymandias. You know that poem of the ruin of the great stone statue that is crumbling to dust in the sand, and he's philosophizing on that. It's a wonderful, wonderful poem. I think that applies here. Building the Temple of Humanity. So this goes back to the stones that are built and result in the Tower of Babel. And then they're related to the Tower of Destruction. So you can see where he's dancing around and bringing in all these touch points. Don Juan, he brings in as another archetype, the playboy in literature. He is called the Hierophant of Eros, or Amor, the Hierophant of Amor. So the Pope of Love. Sounds like the name of a pop song. And so he is the priest of the mysteries of love. He is not merely, this dilettantish playboy. It is really a very deep archetype, but it's a matter of, you could take Don Juan on the surface, or you could go deep with Don Juan and realize the deeper aspects of this priest of love. Love for its own sake, representing the lover par excellence. So while Orpheus pines after one soul, one representation of love, this is a more inclusive of any representation of Eros, any representation of the works of the goddess of love. Anybody, that fits for Don Juan. That fits into that archetypal power of love par excellence, for its own sake. So that relates it to the Arcanum of the lover, he says. So there you go. There's another one. Then there's the trickster, and I can't even pronounce this name of Tagil Eulenspiegel. Eulenspiegel. The figure of farce, the magic wand of ridicule, the mocker, and of course the court jester in Shakespeare's poems comes, Shakespeare's literature comes from, doesn't it? From this jester, this fool, who is the person who mocks and is a militant anarchist and revolts for the sake of the humbler people against those who flex authority, those who prescribe and prescribe what people should and should not do. The jokester, the jester comes in and just turns that. The jester in the court was the one figure, the clown, who was supposedly not to be taken seriously. Therefore, the jester was free to say anything and to insult the king, insult the authorities utterly. He was free to say anything he wanted. That was his role. And in that sense, it's a role of gaining perspective, learning how to gain perspective, which involves humor, it involves mocking, it involves belittling sometimes the powers that are pompous or that presume to control our world. So there's a modern version of this going around now, which is Pepe the Frog. That's all I'll say. Look up Pepe the Frog. You will find thousands of memes with Pepe the Frog in it. And Pepe is our modern day trickster, definitely. I will go no further with that, but look it up. Kirkegaard, he then touches on Kirkegaard as the father of existentialism. So he's moving here into how the fool infiltrates through philosophy and through our literature. So he goes into he revisits the concept of doubt, the doubt of the whole personality, which is founded on despair. I remember reading Fear and Trembling and the Sickness Unto Death when I was in my early 20s of Kirkegaard. And it was just a foundational book. It blew my mind. The story of the leap of faith, which is what Kirkegaard is about, the leap of faith, where Abraham, he gives the example, the story of Abraham being directed by God to sacrifice Isaac. And that he goes right up to the moment of holding the knife to sacrifice his son, and God holds his hand. God is acknowledging that Abraham made that leap of faith in an existential moment of utter personal freedom. So, but moving away from that, he goes on to Hamlet as being an important archetype of the isolation of completely autonomous consciousness, cut off both from nature and the spiritual world. Man at the 0 point between the two fields of gravitation, terrestrial and celestial. And this reminds me of the Hangman card. So again, it seems like he's sort of dancing and touching on all of the previous letters. It's just touching on all of them, and then wants them to be drawn together by the reader. The person who's contemplating these letters needs to start pulling it together. So when you have radical choice, there's doubt, and for the existentialist, there is no escape, as Sartre says. There is no escape. So the only thing that allows you to escape is an act of faith, the leap of faith of Abraham vis-a-vis Isaac. Or the other choice is to go into despair and madness. So that is what's at play there. He then goes on to the figure of Dr. Faust and goes on and very deeply into the Faustian man, because the Faustian man he feels represents the modern man, the modern permutation of the fool, who in the epoch of humanism, so he has to bring in humanism here in our modern age. And he describes Faust as the synthesis of 6 archetypes, plus the eternal Job. the one who was tried and tested. But he places Faust on the sort of an opposite side of Job as being the one who is not tried and tested, but is given every single advantage on the physical plane, every single thing. What's the phrase he uses? He's the temptation of modern man with all the pleasures here below. He has access to everything. Where Job was being denied the pleasures of the flesh, Faust is given all the pleasures of the flesh, and so Mephistopheles works on him from that angle. That if all of the powers and desires here below are satisfied by the prince of this world, then what? Then begins the trial of what Tomberg calls the trial of satisfied desires, which is that of Faust. So the Faustian trial, vis-a-vis, then he goes into how that relates to the occultist world, the world of occultists, which he sums up as being the difference between arbitrary magic, which would be the Faustian, do what thou wilt, versus divine magic, gnosis and mysticism of Christian Hermeticism. So then he will transform himself from, page 600 is where I touched on here, found something important. Let me find that. The page 600 back here. So then he will transform himself from a scholar into a sage, from a magician into a mage, from a Gnosticizer into a Gnostic, and from an amateur in the mysteries into a mystic. So be it. So that's what Tomberg has to say about where he feels the path of Christian Hermeticism takes the occultist. Okay, so I'll leave that alone. So the Fool, as personal consciousness giving way to cosmic consciousness, where the self, the ego, is no longer the author of the act of consciousness, but is its receiver, obedient to the law of poverty, obedience, and chastity. And of course, we heard about those vows very early on. So there's the double meaning, which of course we always have.
And that relates to the two numbers as well, because with the zero, with the zero, you've got the absolute consciousness, and then the 21 is the personal consciousness and working through the arcana to get to that point. Just to jump in, because you mentioned the two types of consciousness, and it is linked to the two numbers.
Yes. So yes, and he talks about the 22, that the Fool could not be 22 because that's too static. But the 21 is a more dynamic. It has a lot of motion.
Yeah, and Meads and Shmakov go into that more. I won't go into that now because you're in full flight, but they do explain more about the numerology.
Charlotte has just published her book on Shmakov.
That doesn't mean I understand it all, by the way.
But she has translated Shmakov's work on the Holy Book of Thoth, the Emerald Tablet, and it's an extraordinary thing. I hope she shows it to us. There it is. It's a huge tome. She said she might have to put it into 2 volumes. She had to print it in that large format so that people could read it. Otherwise, the text would just be too small. Right?
Yeah.
Charlotte?
Yeah, the one the Russian one, the text is minute, and I thought, well, nobody's going to read that. Especially the footnotes, because he has about 800 footnotes. So I thought, no, it needs to be bigger. But it's very, very, very complicated, and I'm only just starting to get into that one as well.
It's just an amazing accomplishment. So congratulations on that, on the publishing of that book in such short order with the Meebs book and the Rudnikova book. It's amazing. Charles, aren't you amazed at what Charlotte has done?
No, Charles does books as well.
Can't imagine how amazed. I've been promoting her.
Yeah.
Telling people about her. So.
He has been. He's the first I heard. He blew the clarion trumpet to announce that your book had come out, was wonderful. And I thank you for that, Charles. I read that first and I was like, yes, it's exciting. So back to this personal consciousness emerging into cosmic consciousness. And I was quoting on page 603. So yeah, the greater manas, the manas buddhai. So this goes into the task of this arcanum, and he goes over and over it, is the task of the alchemical synthesis of intellectual of intellectuality with spirituality, and that this alchemical fusion is the philosopher's stone, and that is the goal. So he says that, in other words, the tarot arcanum, the Fool, is related to the transformation of the personal consciousness into cosmic consciousness, where the self-ego is no longer the author of the act of consciousness, but is its receiver, obedient to the law of poverty, obedience, and chastity. And I read that again because I think that was a very important concept. He talks about the warning here. There's the model and the warning. So the model of the Fool is that of elevated consciousness, transcendental consciousness, which is radical freedom. But the danger is the descent into madness, the descent into, through, I would imagine, spiritual megalomania, the Chariot card. Spiritual megalomania always is a danger. And so one can fall from that state of transcendental consciousness into madness quite easily. And this is a warning. So he describes this as the two modes of sacrificing the intellect. He's going into the mode, the method, which he calls the sacrificium intellectus. So that is either, the choice is to place the intellect in the service of transcendental consciousness, or to abandon the intellect altogether. And he describes the two different pathways, but mostly he explains it through going back to St. John of the Cross as a model of the intellect being silenced by the presence of, and so being enhanced by the presence, not abandoned. So mystical ecstasy, he puts that aside. He's like, mystical ecstasy, or the whirling of the whirling dervish, or the desire of the mystic to completely abandon and void the intellect. He says, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about is the absorption of the intellect entirely by the divine presence, the absolute light, moving the consciousness into the cloud of unknowing, that darkness, the mystical darkness, and emerging on the other side with an intellect which is endowed with new tendencies and has a direct imprint of divine and absolute truth. And this is a working of the reworking of the will underlying conscious thought. So it's a very much an activity which moves the intellect into a higher gear. Excuse me, frog in my throat. So the dervish, or the merely ecstatic mystic, does not pass beyond the intellectual consciousness, but rather just dispenses with it. So he wanted to illustrate that. The Fool, so the Fool is the arcanum of the marriage or conjunction of opposites. The discursive intellectuality with illuminative spirituality. So I'll read from page 605 if you're following along. The entire history of Hermeticism through the course of the ages is that of continuous inspiration from century to century, on the one hand, and the active response of human intelligence from century to century on the other hand. The 21st arcanum of the tarot is therefore that of the Hermeticist method of sacrificing the intellect to spirituality in such a way that it grows and develops instead of becoming enfeebled and atrophied. It is the arcanum of the marriage of opposites, the conjunctio oppositorum, the conjunction of opposites, namely discursive intellectuality, illuminative spirituality. Or in other words, it is the alchemical work of the union of human wisdom, which is folly in the eyes of God, with divine wisdom, which is folly in the eyes of men, in such a way that the result is not a double folly, but rather a single wisdom, which understands both that which is above and that which is, understands both that which is above and that which is below. And
That's the ultimate resolving of binaries, isn't it? In one arcanum.
the collapsing of the binaries is the continuing theme. So human wisdom and divine wisdom, and again, the paradox of human wisdom being considered folly by God, and God's wisdom and divine wisdom being considered folly by humans. So there's a mystery right there. So then he goes on into, he goes deeply, and I'm going to just skirt over this quickly, because he revisits the the relationship between intellectuality and spirituality on the historical plane, which always concerns a Hermeticist. He skirts over paganism, natural philosophy, Hellenism, Judaism, which is the magical transformation of the world awaited for through messianic prophecy, and then the cross of Christ, which can be understood only through the cross of revelation, which is miracle, and wisdom, immanent logos. So let me move on from that. Cooperation. He talks about this binary, which first starts out as a complete binary, and then it begins to blend into a parallelism. So within the individual consciousness, I would say one begins to be able to embrace these paradoxes. One begins to let them co-inhere within one's consciousness, so they can just hang together and play together, even though they seem to contradict each other on the logical level, on the level of pure formal logic. They don't hang, but you just let them sort of marinate there. I'm trying to put this in my own words. You let this marinate in the consciousness, and then eventually this parallelism becomes channeled down into a fusion of these types of understanding, the spiritual and the intellectual. They become fused, and this alchemical work is the work of what he calls the Philosopher's Stone, which is the be-all and end-all goal of the esotericist work. Hermes Trismegistus, he gives a quote from him on page 607, which I thought was extraordinary. The Philosopher's Stone of spiritual alchemy is described in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus as follows: the father thereof is the sun, the mother the moon. The wind carried it in its womb. The earth is the nurse thereof. It is the father of all works of wonder, thelema, throughout the whole world. The power thereof is perfect, if it be cast onto earth. It will separate the element of earth from that of fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great sagacity. It doth ascend from earth to heaven. Again, it doth descend to earth, and uniteth in itself the force from things superior and things inferior. This means to say that the process of induction, which ascends from earth to heaven, and that of deduction, which descends to earth, the process of prayer, which ascends from earth to heaven, and that of revelation, which descends to earth, i.e., human endeavor and the action of grace from above, unite and become a complete circle, which contracts and concentrates to become a point where the ascent and descent are simultaneous and coincide. And this point is the Philosopher's Stone, the principle of the identity of the human and divine, of humanism and prophetism, intelligence and revelation, and intellectuality and spirituality combined. So that's a wonderful quote. It's just full. And this is his unpacking of what Hermes Trismegistus is saying there. So, Charlotte, do you have anything to add to that?
Not to that in particular, I was sort of thinking ahead as you were speaking to when he's talking about the principle of the avatar, which he talks about the principle of the avatar, which comes down, and then the principle of the Buddha, which is working upwards. So when you were talking about the parallel channels, that was what I had in my mind, that section. I don't know if you're going to come to that. Or...
yeah.
I thought you would. So.
And let me just, skip ahead now, because it can just get to, he is doing a lot of going over what he's gone over before, dancing through it all. And it's lovely to watch the dance, but it is a revisiting of the earlier letters. Like you said, if you were to read this one letter as the cliff notes of the entire Meditations on the Tarot, you might be able to do that. I would say that would be done with great difficulty, but you might be able to do that. So he goes on, he revisits the working of spirituality, intellectuality, as they filter down through Plato and Aristotle, through the Greek fathers, et cetera, as revealed through truths, through the channels of scholasticism, where the great human endeavor continues to achieve the synthesis of intellectuality and spirituality, where philosophy is the servant of theology. The alchemical work coming to full fusion, though, was not achieved by the scholastics, so he moves on from that. The alchemical marriage of the sun and the moon, the philosopher's stone, goes above and beyond what the scholastics achieved. He then goes on to talk about the spirits, the guardians of the spiritual work. The guardians of the spiritual work is to me another word for the Hermeticist, because they must be familiar with the study of the heritage of the past. They must understand the value of continuous creative endeavor, aiming at the advancement of the great work, the living tradition, which deepens and elevates and increases always. They are the guardians. The Hermeticist is the guardian of that pathway. And so there's always a collaboration of revelation and humanism. And that is where he goes into the discussion of the avatars, the imams and the Buddhas. But he tells, there's a little interesting aside here where he talks about how important it is to acknowledge and encourage the climate of expectation in the world, that there's a climate of expectation in the world amongst humanity. And I think that's an interesting concept, because that is what I guess you would call hope. And that we need to be able to keep the flame of hope alive. And this is what he says the role of the avatars, the Buddhas, etc., is. These personalities that represent, the avatars are personalities which represent the culminating points of revelation from above, and they descend with revelations. They come to us through Krishna and Rama, and through the saints. And that is the Hindu world of the avatars, which he then distinguishes, even though Sri Aurobindo is always he says conflating the avatars and the Buddhas. He said that's incorrect. You can't conflate them. They are not. You cannot call, he calls Christ, who is it? Christ and Buddha and Krishna. He kind of put Sri Aurobindo, he puts them all in one basket of avatars, and Tomberg argues that you can't do that. The avatars are a descent from heaven. They descend into humankind to try to harvest the good of mankind, to harvest what's there, but without trying to change the world, without really radically changing the world. They just arrive at certain points in history and try to help humanity along there. The Buddhas represent, he says, the culmination in the points of the epochs where human consciousness has developed to a certain ripening. There's a certain arising or awakening represented by the Buddhas. And there can be more than one Buddha. There are bodhisattvas who then become Buddhas. This is the righteous man, the tzaddik. And so he distinguishes between the saints and the righteous men, that this is more along the lines of pure humanism, he would call it, which is what Buddhism arises from, that the eightfold path of wisdom is the arising and awakening of human wisdom to that point of arising for giving, offering the path, the right-hand path to mankind through the Buddha. So the faith, then he goes into talking about the two loves. The two loves are the love of God and the love of neighbor in Christianity. The two faiths are the faith in God and the faith in man. So this is an interesting thing because he talks about the faith in Jesus Christ as God man unites with the faith in God and the faith in, unites us in faith in God and faith in man. The love for Jesus Christ in us unites our love of God and our love of our neighbor. So to me, that's a very beautiful description of the dynamic of the role of love and faith. And of course, he's touched on hope there. So faith, love, and hope. There you go. These are moving on, dancing along together in a sort of perichoresis dance. They're flowing into each other constantly in Tomberg's work. So there's a long exposition on the avatars as I went into. And he goes into, the 10 avatars of Vishnu, on and on. He talks about Kalki. And I was confused about Kalki. Kalki is one of the avatars who's expected to appear, yes. He has the head of a horse and he's the body of a giant. And I was going to ask Charlotte to explicate that a little bit if you know more about that. No,
I don't know more about the
we'll dance along with this. So we Buddha yeah. Kalki is in the realm of the Hindu deities. It's their expected avatar. So I think he wanted to just touch on the idea of the avatars. So Buddha is the awakened man, the eightfold path as a new understanding of human experience. The Buddha's teaching is all about the human experience. It's about humanism. And so Buddha, therefore, is not an avatar. And that's where Tomberg's making his argument. Jesus Christ is not an avatar either, according to Tomberg, because Jesus's expiatory sacrifice for fallen mankind and the transformation and redemption of the fallen world goes beyond the ken of the avatar's liberation of the good from in the world. Without attempting to transform the fallen world, the avatar his role is circumscribed by this liberation of the good. This is Tomberg talking, so I don't pretend that, I am that expert on avatars. I'm not. But he is trying to unthread Jesus Christ from this whole thing because he's talking about the germination of the Christic seed in human nature, that this is an arcanum about the alchemical fusion, the Christianization of mankind. This is where he brings it back to the Christian path of Hermeticism, that Jesus Christ is God and man fused, and therefore is representative of spirituality and intellectuality, coming down into the historical plane in a state of fusion in the embodiment of Jesus Christ. And this is an embodiment of Christ consciousness. It's awakening of a certain Buddhic consciousness, the greater mind, the metanoia, the Buddhas, the Buddhas, manas. It is the awakening of the greater mind, but it is also coming through the pathway of love. The divination of man, theosis, has to be done through this alchemical fusion of love with knowledge. So love and wisdom, they're often called, and Theosophists, I remember talking always about love, wisdom, always talking about love, wisdom. The Maitreya Buddha and Christ walking hand in hand as love, wisdom. And I always thought that's just a little clunky, that's a bit clunky, to be trying to fuse the Maitreya Buddha with Jesus or Sophia. So, Christ, Sophia. So it's a little clunky when it gets into the head. So it's important what Tomberg's doing here with constantly interjecting the dance, the importance of love in this dance, amour, the fool. It's so important. This fusion of the avatar and the Buddha principle into a single personality Then he goes on to a big talk about the fusion of the prayer of fire, prayer as fire, and then prayer in the form of meditation as water. So water being the receptive version of meditation, being receptive version of prayer, prayer being the fiery active version. And there's that upward and downward movement again. The sun and moon, fire and water, which of course Charlotte has spoken to us about endlessly, that fire and water mystery, that fusion. I think we're getting back to that, right, Charlotte?
Mm-hmm. Fiery water.
So he goes back into talking about St. Ignatius, as St. Ignatius being an example of the fool in spirit who undergoes the hygienic experience. I don't pretend to understand what this is about. I'm not that familiar with St. Ignatius and his path. So, but he's trying to talk about that intermediary who hangs between the divine and the human world. Again, to me, that's recalling the hangman. So the fool and the hangman seem to me to be very intimately related figures. On the inner plane, so he goes back to talking about the individual experience of spiritual versus intellectual, parallelism, cooperation, fusion, the philosopher's stone, spiritual alchemy, formal logic yielding to organic logic, which yields to moral logic as part of this process. This is, again, another quick summation, Cliff Notes version of what he's always been talking about throughout the letters. Then he goes big time into talking about mystical prayer and meditation as that process of divine respiration, how important that is. The head and the heart united in meditation and prayer. This activity, the respiration of what he calls, would be the genesis of love, creative love, and the immortality of created beings, which is the fruits of meditation. The fruits of meditation, and you can go read on page 619. He goes into metaphysics. I think that's very important. The metaphysics are what are grasped through practice of meditation. The direct knowledge of eternal and immutable principles must be grasped through the expanded consciousness, the enabling consciousness of what meditation brings in deepening our understanding. Metaphysics cannot be understood like physical physics does in a physics class. Metaphysics. And my argument has been that the problem with Christianity for a very long time, I would argue since meditation fell out of the practices in the Middle Ages, they're now coming back in, but since meditation was dropped and that deepening through direct knowledge of metaphysics has then also fallen apart, and that Christian metaphysics is absolutely goopy, gooey, and non-existent. And there is nothing to hang on the skeleton of Christianity unless you have the metaphysics as the muscular structure and the internal structure of the skeleton. You must have that in order to hang all the principles of Christianity. I would argue this is why a lot of Christians have just fallen away, because it just doesn't jibe with the stories. To them just don't jibe with their understanding of metaphysics or physics. So that's just one of my arguments. The deepening of the divine mysteries through the Kabbalistic practices, through the Zohar as a source. He talks about these different methodologies of where the fruits of meditation come and to what end they are sought. And in Christian meditation, he specifically describes our deepening of the understanding of Holy Scripture and the creation through our consciousness of Jesus's work of redemption, through the 7 stages of the Passion. That's a very specific thing. And if you've never meditated on the 7 stages of the Passion, I recommend that you do, because there's great richness there, great richness to be achieved through the working on those, each of the 7 stages of the Passion. So in sum, the Hermeticist path, though, is the fruits of meditation. There, he just blows it wide open. He says, it is to advance the work of the alchemical transformation of mankind. And it starts at the beginning in contemplation of the 7 days of creation, moves into the 7 stages of the fall, the 7 miracles of St. John gospel, the 7 I ams of Jesus concerning himself, the statements of Jesus concerning himself, the 7 words of Jesus crucified, and the 7 stages of the passion. If that doesn't give you enough material for a lifetime of meditative studies, I don't know what does, but that's his summation at the end of this. And I'll quote you from the last page of this Arcanum, because it's wonderful. To the idea of deepening into love, into the heart of things, and the mysteries. And the last page is, where is it there? Here we go. Having attained this contemplation of things surpassing actual understanding, meditation becomes prayer. Just as prayer, which attains the state of contemplation without words, becomes meditation. And it is this alchemical marriage of prayer and meditation, of the sun and the moon, of the soul's inner heaven, which takes place in the soul of the human being, who is in the process of realizing the Arcanum, the Fool. The Arcanum of the union of revelation from above and human wisdom, whilst avoiding madness. The Arcanum of the formation of the Philosopher's Stone, where the twofold certainty of revelation from above and human knowledge is concentrated. That's just lovely. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Alice. But doesn't it just show how much is in this Arcanum, that it's absolutely immense? I mean, I was thinking about it last night as well, and I thought, well, you're going to do a great summation. Maybe I can give some hints of some of the background to it as well from some of the other works, because I think that with this, like, Tomberg really sits down and invites us for coffee. He kind of puts his hat on the table and says, okay, let's just have a bit of a chat now, because there's so much that we've just gone through. I mean, Meebs, he talks about the numbers, and he says that the 0 should be understood as a hint at the exceptional position of this Arcanum in relation to all the others, whereas 21 is more fruitful. And he also delivers quite a warning in his treatment of this letter.
Charlotte, come forward. We can't hear you.
To not be subject to the involuntary action of the invincible shin. This is where we're looking at the abyss that the Fool is about to step into. And he says that the symbology of the card intentionally presents this negative aspect, because even though the fruits of the Arcanum are so tremendous, as you've just set out for us, really the summation of the whole Hermetic philosophy, the danger inherent in this through the power of the shin is equally great. And just as the esoteric name of the Fool is love, we're reminded that we fall in love into this abyss, which is clearly shown on the card. And Meebs also mentions the Fool's hat and says, don't let somebody else put the Fool's hat upon you. Be the master of the hat. You be the one that puts the hat upon yourself or onto somebody else, because once you're engaged in this study and you're on this walk, there is a hat. And either you will have control of it or somebody else, but you know, there's a great personal responsibility here with the Arcanum. He says it is a terrible Arcanum, and that to apply it ineptly or in the wrong time is actually to delay the course of world evolution, because we're in the process of aligning our personal consciousness with the divine. And obviously, if you hit the mark there, the potential for personal power is tremendous, but that's not the point. It's to reintegrate with the divine. But it says at the same time, the highest, most powerful synthetic pentagram of the astral, which is the Yod-Heh, Shin-Vau-Heh, the tetragrammaton with the shin in the middle, precisely by its sign shin, gives itself the possibility of incarnation. It's a reference point to the atonement of human collectivities and consequently the reintegration of the primary perfect man. So that's referring to what we've looked at in the past as the Redeemer cliche. So the tetragrammaton with the shin inserted, the God man. And he says that regarding the number 21, that we require all the previous 20 arcana so that we don't fall into the trap of the abyss. So that it's in order for the Fool of Shin to lead us to the triumph of the Rosicrucian reintegration by the process of the full threefold application of the great arcanum of magic, mysticism, gnosis, and magic. So I think that your emphasis on recapping all of the other arcana in this was absolutely correct, because that is exactly what we're supposed to do. That is the whole point of this. We're also reminded that the mantle of the Fool is what helps us to traverse the belt of lies, the zone of delusion. The reminder that the zone of delusion is out there, so don't be the foolish fool. But at the same time, the Fool, like the Don Juan, has the innocence to enable us to cross that. We've already talked about the binary being inherent in the Fool and its synthesis. And then he says the fall is metaphysically fast, but the rebirth is metaphysically slow. So there's another warning, and just bearing in mind that what can be a lightning process at some stages can take lifetimes when it comes to actually returning. Shmakov, I'll just a little couple of outtakes from this, because as I mentioned, this is his kind of everything is the Fool, and he says Arcanum 0 or Arcanum 21 together with the world, the next one, 22, together represents the final synthesis. And Arcanum 0 is the teaching of the absolute world first cause of the one reality. I won't go any more into what he says because I think it's too complicated. I do just want to mention Nina Rudnikova, because this is where he really she was his initiator, and she was the one, I think, who taught him about love being the esoteric name of the Fool, because she makes that quite clear in her solar path that love is the name here. And she again talks about the negative aspect. So she says, so the picture describes the person in a negative aspect, that is, it says how not to act. Its purpose is to disguise the 21st principle, the construction of which can give dangerous keys to the walking person if they are handed over prematurely. The secret of this principle is revealed after initiation into hermeticism, that is, after mastering the apparatus of the earthly Baphomet, and only when the consciousness is completely and firmly closed in the spiritual world can this mystery be perceived without the danger of decomposition of one's own consciousness and break down into black magic. And I think Tomberg also goes into how many of these mages, particularly the French ones that he so admired, did actually turn away from the ceremonial magic and towards the path of Christian mysticism, because they figured this out for themselves and they had the level of consciousness to understand this. And he says this mystery, she says, this mystery relates to the construction of the apparatus of the universal creative mind of which we are a part, and thus giving the keys to man's own self-creation and creativity threatens to cause skepticism in him much more hopeless and deep than ordinary human skepticism, if the human consciousness has not outgrown itself. Those areas that lie above the principle of reason can no longer be called areas of manifestation of consciousness, because they go to the very depths of the subjective spirit and open only with the fading of consciousness, that is, the ability to distinguish between subject and object. These areas are reached not by the exertion of reason or consciousness, but by the exertion of mystical religious feeling, and can be marked by the meaningless word superconsciousness. And she goes on to talk about the meetings of the second Guardian of the Threshold, the first meeting and the second meeting. I mean, the whole of her Arcanum is about love. So if you do have, I mean, I could send this round actually to people if they haven't got the book, just an extract from her Fool, because I do think it really helps us understand what some of what Tomberg was alluding to, but also some of the dangers which he maybe doesn't bring out quite so much. Probably because he's already got us there by safe means in his own book.
He certainly did. Yeah. So when I was talking about where Tomberg talks about the guardians, again, so I interpreted that he's talking about the Hermeticist path as being the path of the guardians. But we are the manifestation on the historical plane of the guardians. But there's the other levels of the guardians of the thresholds. Those are the other guardians, and those are the guardians that we are not worthy to become guardians until we have passed the test with the guardians of the threshold. We ourselves can't, till we pass that, bring past not, or whatever, that there it is. There's the ceiling, and it's there for your safety. It's there for your safety, not to blast through it. Just like I talked about the chakra systems and how it's very dangerous to try to blast through and rise to the higher chakras with Kundalini energy, with the serpents. It's very dangerous to do that. And that there are beings which guard each of the chakras, because your consciousness must be ready and prepared to not just get burned up into madness. And that is the danger, that you will be cast down into the abyss. If you prematurely seek powers, CDs of any sort that you're not ready for. As you said, that ascent has to be very slow and very methodical, and using just staying within the rules of, poverty, chastity, and obedience. He gives those guidelines.
Do you think that
as long as you stay within them, you're doing okay?
Do you think most people go that way? I mean, because obviously in an ideal world, we'd all get the teachings early, have a teacher, take these careful steps, have our mind opened in the proper way. But do you think that's how most people, do most people not just fall off the cliff first and then have to figure it out?
I don't know. I think the ones that fell off the cliff, we don't hear from again for a while. So we don't really know.
Because the alligator ate them.
I heard things that you have to go start again by being reincarnated as an urchin at the bottom of the sea and start again. There you go. To humble you. Just one of the metaphors.
That's why they say it's such a grave warning, that because they do give this absolutely terrible warning about Shin. I mean, I remember when I first read because I obviously read Meditations on the Tarot first, and his ball on my first reading was, hey, that's all about love. And that was my takeaway. But then when I read Meebs, I was like, whoa, I've been in danger, because look at some of these great big warnings came out to do with this Arcanum, and it made me sort of pause again, because I thought, gosh, I hadn't even seen that side of it, the dangerous side.
I think all of the archetypes he talks about, Orpheus and Don Quixote and Don Juan and Faust, those obviously they all have an implicit warning. They all are a warning of these different ways that you can get carried away, and also just lose your center, and become exploded and dissipated. So for instance, I just know one example I've seen frequently in our time is yoga teachers who become like rock stars. They become adulated yoga teachers. Their adulation, they found a certain school of yoga, and the next thing you know, they are having sex with all their students, and they are indulging in drugs. They did have access to the CDs, some of the powers. They had access to occult powers that they got through yoga practice. And this is why that path can be very dangerous, especially to unevolved type A's.
Yeah. And that's the path that most people are being taught, young people. And it's so attractive. And I think you actually nailed it pretty well when you talked about the metaphysical side of things, how that the Eastern philosophies do give that, and so people are instinctively attracted to the framework which they can reason through, and then the physical practice by which they will get results, because they'll start to feel the power and you do, but without having any concept that as they're rising, there's a great big cliff that's, you know, an abyss that's getting deeper and deeper underneath them. And at the end of the day, you're not going to go anywhere. So you'll get to a certain point rising, but then there'll be the ring passing off that you will never get through.
Exactly.
So you're either
And
going to fall,
all
or you have to stay hovering.
all we know is that those yoga teachers who were adulated, they cause an enormous ripple of disappointment and disarray amongst their students who were following them. Teachers who fall. We've heard this through Baba Yar and all these so-called, you know, teachers that especially arose in the 60s, and people followed them, and heck, you know, followed them right off the cliff. And then they're shattered. These people are absolutely shattered because they put all their faith in these teachers that they thought were so powerful and so omniscient. Well, that's a warning to them to not do that again. Guess you won't do that again, and you'll learn your lesson. And to the one who fell, oh boy, you will really have to pay a heavy price. Not only is your personality on this plane absolutely destroyed because you've destroyed your reputation and your ability to even make a living, probably, you've become so disgraced. The fool's hat gets placed on you, and that's it. You are toast. But on top of that, you have to deal with what you've just incurred in your personal karma of leading people as a teacher and then leading them off the cliff.
Yeah, because they would carry the burden of those students they led.
Yes.
I mean, the
Absolutely.
students themselves will have to do their own work.
So devastating. It's devastating. To be the path of a spiritual teacher and then to fall is such a greater fall into the abyss than being someone who is a fool, who's just ignorant at the beginning of the path.
Yeah, that's the value, the protection of the blindfold, isn't it? Because you can't,
value of the
you
what?
don't see the protection of the blindfold.
Yes.
That's part of it, I think, for exactly the reason you mentioned. Because if you had the knowledge and the power, then you'd be in that position of potentially falling from an absolutely immense height, which you will do. Because
you will do. And this is why, going back to the example of yoga, I really despise all of these teacher programs, teacher mills that are cranking out these so-called yoga teachers who are really irresponsibly teaching the practices, these ancient practices of the postures and asanas, irresponsibly, without insisting that the students work hand in hand with at least the very basics of the Hindu philosophy presented in Patanjali. And to understand, you need to understand the Yoga Sutras at the very minimum to stay grounded and to not get carried away by the cities, by the powers that you're going to be developing in your physical body, which will be very dangerous. It's like fire. You have to know what you're handling. That's why I like the Iyengar school. In the Iyengar school, it was always very much emphasized by Iyengar himself and all of his senior teachers that you should not study. This is interesting. You should not study pranayama, which is breath work, which is the refined version of respiration, which is teaching you the basics of spiritual respiration. You must not study pranayama until you've had at least 1 year of asana practice to cure to clear out your channels, your nadis.
I was just
there has to be a purification before you go to the next step.
Because Tomberg, he warns about the breathing, and I remember when I was doing a lot of yoga, and I didn't even realize what was happening, but I'd get into meditation. I would just stop breathing for large periods. I became in such a deep meditative state that I would take an in-breath, lock the bundas, whatever they're called.
Lock the bandhas, yes.
And then I realized I was forgetting how to breathe, that I was getting into a separate body state. And this went on for quite a few, because I was doing a lot of yoga at the time. I didn't really understand the yoga I was doing. I was practicing it quite intensively, just because I wanted to keep fit, to be honest. But then I found myself with these breathing practices, and actually I got quite frightened, and I just stopped doing it, because I realized that I was just holding my breath and going into crazy states that were going to become uncontrollable.
what you were practicing was the art of kumbhaka, which is breath retention, and it is very powerful, where you learn to hold the breath inside these two bandhas, the Jalandhara bandha and the root chakra and the root bandha, mula bandha. You lock these down and hold. It's an alchemical vessel of the breath contained in the body. You do not mess with alchemical practices of the breath until you have a little bit more of a foundation.
Yeah. I mean,
John.
I didn't even realize I was being taught it at the time, or that it was happening.
Exactly.
But when I did,
Irresponsibly
I
so,
realized I
yes.
stopped. Yeah.
John? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, dear.
That's better, isn't it?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I don't know if I've been accidentally doing some of that, because 6 years ago when I was having an operation, the last words I heard the anaesthetist say to me, "Don't forget to breathe, Mr. Goldsmith." But I clearly did remember. What I really wanted to say is that throughout virtually the whole course of this session, I've been thinking, is there a connection between the Fool and the Arcanum Justice? Because the Fool is this professional anarchist. You think you've got a word of wisdom, ha, ha, ha. You think there's this authority, ha, 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 and so on. And all those arcana, the arcanum of the Pope, ecclesiastical authority, well, we all know how to dispose of that. The arcanum of the lovers, well, love is wonderful and it can also be utterly trivial and degrading. And so the Fool has got this incredibly important vocation to say, is this really what it seems, or is it just a trick? Are you kidding yourselves, dear? But then comes along justice. And justice, as I understand it, says, okay, the crucial thing is all about love, but it also, in this world of duality in which we live, it has to be lived out both in proportion, so that you don't have two eyes for an eye, but an eye for an eye. And similarly, you need to have the sword, which is effectiveness. You need to be effective and you need to be in proportion, which is incredibly boring. What we really want to do is to say, love, that is the important thing, but we won't get to that stage at all unless we learn about proportionality and effectiveness. Otherwise, we're just up with the fairies. So I just wondered if anyone has seen a connection between the Fool and Justice, who seem to complement each other absolutely brilliantly. And by the way, Tomberg is so wrong. Look at the picture at the front of this Arcanum. The dog isn't attacking him. The dog is jumping up at him. When dogs jump up at you like this, they are being friendly. If they are wanting to attack you, they go low. Ah!
But it's distracting him.
It is distracting him just at the crucial moment.
So thank you for.
Wonderful. Absolutely right. This is a dance of connecting all the arcana. He wants to know how well you've learned. And you're learning, you're making those correlations. The correlation with justice I hadn't thought of, but that's wonderful, John.
No, I hadn't. It's great.
Dory, what's on your mind? You're muted.
It does come across with that message. So that's good. The one thing I had read this week, and this was a meditation that Richard Rohr had, and talking about Paul. And for Paul, the code words for non-dual thinking are foolishness and folly. And he said, in effect, my thinking is foolishness to you. And he goes into the folly of the cross breaks down the dualistic mind. And, because on the cross, God took the one thing that, the killing of the God human and made it into the best thing, and the very redemption of the world, and then the compassionate holding of essential meaninglessness of Jesus on the cross. And that just breaking down this dualism. And the way he described it was really the foolishness of humans in both the intellectual, but then also the ecstatic spiritual, and how Jesus took that and just meshed it together right there on the cross. And that just made this come alive for me, having read that in those terms, or the Pauline terms of that. So thank you.
That's great. That sounds like exactly where Tomberg would be coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pam, what did you think of this one?
Hi. Well, I'm not laughing like the fool. I'm laughing because I am the fool, because I read 21 because it was 21, and of course, I thought, oh, we're at the end. We're in the world. So I read the world, which was awesome. I mean, I was like, oh, the world. Every chapter I read is like, this is the best chapter. But you've all given a fantastic synopsis of the fool, and I'm going to go back and relish it. And thanks, Dory, for mentioning Richard Rohr. My liberal Catholic friends love him, and this might be an entree into introducing them to a little bit of which they won't touch. So, and that's it. I've been busy as a grandmother. I'm getting to watch my grandson in the mornings, and took off for y'all.
So it's great to have you here, though. Great to have you here in whatever capacity you could. I was floating in and out of the
or no capacity
all weekend.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, go back and read The Fool
Sure.
with the wisdom that you gained from the World card. That should be interesting.
Yes.
That is our last Arcanum.
What do you reckon, Charles? What do you think about the Fool?
Actually, I do have a question, since the topic of Kundalini came up, and there's this fellow who keeps calling me, very intelligent fellow, and he said he did some exercise or whatever with somebody, and he raised up his Kundalini, apparently prematurely, and now he's like depressed all the time and lost and nihilistic, and I don't know exactly what to tell him. When I talk to him and try to get him grounded somehow, he's okay, but then he doesn't know how to stay grounded all the time. And he's got a good life. He's got a good life, good family life, good job, good career. So yeah, there's that danger of doing some of these yoga exercises prematurely. I think that's probably one of the reasons why Steiner said that these yoga Eastern practices is not appropriate to Western people today.
Yeah.
Probably because they don't have enough proper teachers around. As you pointed out, they have a lot of, night school. They go to take a class at night school and become a yoga teacher the next day. But the Fool's interesting. Now you gave me an idea, because I've been working on there's a couple areas I like to work on is popular culture. And so I watched this movie last weekend called Jack Reacher. Actually watched two of them. And I was thinking about the Fool. He's beholden to nobody. He has, in one sense, you could call him amoral. In another sense, he's very moral, because he tries to do good in his own way, but he has no respect for any laws or traditions. He just goes for it. So it was an interesting character for me. And now that this topic came up, I can relate it to the Fool archetype. And also Don Quixote is one of my favorite characters. Everybody thinks he's a fool because he wants to go out and seek justice, love, and he doesn't care what anybody thinks. And everybody tries to trick him and call him a fool and everything. And is he? And the other thing I'm working on too, which now I can have, I've been working on it for months and haven't had a way to complete it, but now I think I do. In Islam, there's this character called Al-Qadr, the Green Man.
Yeah.
People relate him to, say, the Buddha or the Green Knight, or even, I guess, St. George.
Mhm.
But the story is it just fascinates me, probably because I'm an outsider, and it just struck me a certain way. Is that this character Al-Qadr confronts Moses and tells Moses had just seen God, talked in the presence of God, face to face, took all the laws and knows everything. And this Kidder character comes around and says, I know things you don't know. Saying, what kind of brazen person is that? He knows things that Moses doesn't know. And he goes into these stories. He takes Moses in the story. I guess there was three different events. I'll mention one of them. They're on a ship. The ship is going back to some kingdom. And what Al-Qadr does is he punches a hole in the ship and makes it sink. And Moses is appalled. And another trip, he kills a boy, murders a boy. And Moses is appalled. And then only at the end does he sort of justify it by saying, well, the king was on the other side, and he was going to arrest and persecute all these people in the boat. So I figure it's better to them not to make it to the other shore. Then he talks about this boy who was going to grow up to be some sort of tyrant or something. And, to me, it's a very hard teaching, but when we look at all the things we think are evil in the world, we don't understand. And saying, maybe there is some hidden order there that even Moses didn't know. And we read the passages like, God does everything for some higher purpose. Everything turns to good. And sometimes it's really hard to believe. Then I think about Kidder. Maybe there is some higher order there. So I'm going to